Claire liked places that made other 3 days before Christmas, I woke up before sunrise because the house was too quiet. Not peaceful quiet. Dead quiet. The kind that presses against your ears until you start listening for sounds you already know will never come again. No kettle in my mother's kitchen. No television muttering from my father's den. No footsteps. No voices. Just the old heating system pushing weak air through the vents like the place itself was struggling to stay alive. I lay there for a minute, staring at the ceiling, trying to remember what day it was. December 22nd, 3 days until Christmas. My first one without either of them. My father died in March. My mother followed in August, as if grief had simply hollowed out the rest of her and left nothing worth repairing. People say things after funerals. They're together again. They're at peace. At least they didn't suffer long. I heard all of it. I nodded at all the right moments. Then I came home to a house full of furniture, framed photographs, and a kind of silence that is weight. I finally sat up and swung my feet onto the floor. The hardwood was cold enough to make me hiss through my teeth. I used to think retirement would feel like relief. After 32 years in financial compliance, I had earned that belief. I imagined slower mornings, coffee taken properly instead of swallowed between meetings, maybe a little travel, maybe reading books I had stacked for years and never opened. Instead, retirement arrived like an empty waiting room. I pulled on a gray sweater and walked downstairs. The banister still had one strand of green garland my mother never took down because she said a house looked kinder with Christmas in it. It had brown at the edges. I stood there with my hand on the rail, looking at it longer than I should have. In the kitchen, I filled the kettle out of habit, then stopped myself. There was nobody to make tea for except me. Even that felt excessive. The window over the sink showed a backyard washed in pale winter light. Bare trees, frost on the fence, a bird hopping once across the patio before thinking better of it and disappearing. Everything outside looked as reluctant as I felt. I made coffee black and carried it into the dining room. My parents' chairs were still tucked neatly under the table. My mother's reading glasses still sat on the sideboard beside a dish of peppermints no one had touched in months. I had spent most of the year sorting paperwork, canceling accounts, signing forms, thanking people for casseroles I never wanted, and pretending I was handling it better than I was. That morning, for the first time, I admitted something to myself. Grief was terrible, but loneliness was colder. And in that house, with Christmas creeping toward me and no voices left to fill the rooms, I began to understand that cold could settle into a man deeper than bone. By mid-morning, I decided I should at least bring down the Christmas boxes. That was the kind of thing people expected from a man still functioning. You lose your parents, you keep moving. You put up a tree, you hang the old ornaments. You perform the season until it begins to resemble something livable. I was not interested in any of it. But the attic had to be cleaned eventually, and delaying pain has never made it smaller. The pull-down ladder groaned when I opened it. A stripe of dusty air came down with it, dry and stale, carrying that attic smell of cardboard, insulation, and forgotten years. I climbed slowly, one hand on the rail, the other braced against the frame. Retirement had taken my schedule, not my knees. The attic was dim except for the weak yellow bulb hanging from a cord in the center. Storage bins were stacked in rows my father had once called organized and my mother had called good enough. There were old reeds, wrapping paper, a broken table lamp, my father's golf clubs, bags of winter clothes no one would ever wear again. I found the Christmas decorations near the far wall under a faded quilt. As I pulled one of the bins free, another smaller plastic container tipped sideways and cracked open when it hit the floor. A few old papers slid out. A dried ribbon, a bent photograph, and beneath them, a blue journal with a cloth cover, worn pale at the corners. It didn't belong in a holiday box. I picked it up and brushed the dust off of my sleeve. No name on the cover, no date, just that faded blue fabric and the slight swell of pages that had been written in heavily. I stood there for a second, thinking it might have been my mother's. She kept notes on everything. Recipes, shopping lists, medication times, names of neighbors she distrusted. I opened it expecting something ordinary. The first page was in Linda's handwriting. I knew it immediately. Tight, neat script. Controlled. The kind of handwriting that looked pleasant until you realized how hard the pen had been pressed into the paper. At the top of the page, she had written a date from 6 years earlier. Under it, a single sentence. Tom has a talent for making a room feel smaller just by entering it. I read it twice. Then I turn the page. Another date. Another line. He still thinks silence makes him dignified. Mostly it just makes him dull. Then another. I sometimes look at him across the table and wonder how a man can age into furniture without noticing. The attic seemed to get colder around me. I kept reading, one page after another, each remark more precise than the last. Not angry, not impulsive, crafted, patient, little cuts preserved in ink, as if humiliating me privately had been one of her rituals. By the time I reached the 5th page, I was no longer looking at an unhappy marriage. I was looking at years of deliberate contempt. I didn't take the journal downstairs right away. I sat there on an overturned storage bin, the attic light humming faintly above me, flipping through page after page until the dates blurred together. It wasn't written every day. That would have been easier to dismiss as some kind of outlet. This was spaced out, intentional, like she only wrote when something about me annoyed her enough to preserve it. There were patterns, dinners we had shared, trips I thought had gone well. Even quiet evenings I remembered as peaceful. Each one had a corresponding entry. Not arguments, not conflict, just her observations, stripped of any warmth. Tom doesn't notice when people tolerate him instead of enjoy him. He thinks being responsible makes him interesting. It doesn't. If I disappeared tomorrow, I wonder how long it would take him to realize he was happier. I closed the journal slowly. My first instinct should have been shock, anger, something loud. But none of that came. What I felt instead was recognition, not of the words themselves, but of the space around them, the small gaps in conversations, the way she would look past me instead of at me, the polite tone she used with strangers that never quite made a home. I had noticed it before. I just hadn't named it, because naming something makes it real. And once it's real, you have to respond to it. I set the journal beside me and leaned forward, elbows on my knees, staring at the floorboards between my shoes. The dust there was undisturbed, except for the mark where the bin had slid. A clean line through something that had been sitting untouched for years. That's when another thought settled in, quiet and steady. None of this was new. The journal was only proof. I had already known something was wrong long before I found it. I just chose not to follow it all the way to its conclusion. Instead, I adjusted. I worked longer hours. I stayed quiet when conversations fell off. I told myself stability mattered more than understanding every small discomfort. But I hadn't been blind. Months before I retired, I started noticing things that didn't belong in a stable life. Charges that didn't match routines. Business trips that shifted slightly when I asked about them twice. Names that came up too casually, then disappeared too quickly. Brian, her supervisor. I said his name out loud once in the attic, just to hear it in the open air. It sounded exactly the way I remembered it. Familiar, controlled, carefully placed. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone. For a moment, I just held it there, feeling the weight of it. Then I opened a folder I had never shown anyone. Private ledger. Inside were files, timestamps, scanned receipts, copied emails, notes written late at night when something didn't sit right, and I needed to record it before I convinced myself it didn't matter. The journal in my hand wasn't the beginning. It was confirmation. And confirmation meant something simple. I could stop pretending I didn't understand what I was looking at. I was supposed to stay away until Christmas Eve. That had been Linda's idea. She said it would be easier if I spent a few days at the lake house. Clear your head, she told me, standing in the doorway with that same calm tone she used when discussing grocery lists or utility bills. I'll handle things here. At the time, I agreed without argument. That was before the journal. Before I sat in the attic holding 6 years of quiet contempt in my hands. Before I reopened the folder on my phone and reminded myself that suspicion had already turned into documentation long ago. By early afternoon, I was in my car. I didn't pack much. A small overnight bag. My coat. The journal, placed carefully on the passenger seat, like something fragile. Though it wasn't. It had survived just fine without me knowing it existed. The drive back took just under 2 hours. Gray sky. Empty roads. The kind of winter light that flattens everything into the same dull shade. I kept the radio off. There was no need to fill the space. About 30 minutes out, I started noticing details I wouldn't have questioned before. Linda hadn't asked when I would return. Not specifically. Just Christmas Eve would be fine. No follow-up. No check-in. No small message asking how the lake was, whether I had arrived safely, whether I needed anything. Absence of detail is still detail. I turned onto our street just after 4 in the afternoon. The neighborhood looked exactly as it always did this time of year. Decorated, orderly, pretending at warmth, wreaths on doors, lights strung neatly along rooftops. A few neighbors moving about with that slow, deliberate cheer people adopt in December. Our house stood the same as always, except it didn't. There were cars in the driveway that didn't belong to us. 2 of them. One I recognized after a second look. A dark sedan I had seen parked outside Linda's office before. The other was unfamiliar. Clean. Recently washed. The curtains were drawn. That alone was enough to make me stop the car at the curb, instead of pulling in. Linda didn't draw the curtains during the day. She said it made the house feel closed off, controlled. I sat there with the engine running, watched in front of my own house like it belonged to someone else. Then I noticed the catering trays. They were visible through the narrow gap where the curtains didn't quite meet. Stainless steel, covered, set out on the dining table like something prepared in advance, not assembled casually. Family holiday dinner, she had called it when she mentioned having people over. But nothing about what I was looking at felt like family. It felt arranged, structured, rehearsed. I turned off the engine and stepped out of the car. The cold hit immediately, sharp enough to clear any remaining hesitation. Gravel crunched under my shoes as I walked up the driveway, past the unfamiliar car, toward the front door. I didn't rush. There was no need. Whatever was waiting inside had already been set in motion. And for the first time since I found the journal, I felt something settle into place. Not anger, not fear. Clarity. I reached for the handle and let myself in. The house smelled like roasted meat and polished wood. Too clean. Too deliberate. The kind of smell that doesn't come from cooking. It comes from staging. I closed the door behind me quietly, the latch clicking louder than it should have in the stillness. Voices drifted in from the dining room. Controlled voices. Low, measured, not the loose, overlapping noise of family. This sounded like people waiting for something to begin. For me, I took off my coat slowly and hung it on the rack like I had all the time in the world. My reflection caught in the hallway mirror for a second. Same face, same posture. Nothing about me suggested I had just walked into something planned without me. That was fine. I stepped into the dining room. Linda stood near the head of the table. She was dressed carefully. Dark green dress. Simple jewelry. Hair done in that restrained way she preferred when she wanted to look composed rather than warm. She didn't look surprised to see me. She looked prepared. To her right was Brian. He stood slightly behind her, hands loosely clasped, posture relaxed in a way that only comes from confidence. Not surprise. Not discomfort. He nodded once when he saw me, like we were colleagues meeting at a scheduled appointment. At the table sat 3 others. Kevin, Linda's brother, leaned back in his chair with that same familiar expression of quiet arrogance, like he'd already decided how everything would end and was just waiting for it to catch up. Next to him, a man I didn't recognize immediately, but his suit did the introduction for him. Tailored, neutral, professional, a lawyer, and at the far end, Mrs. Hargrove, family friend, neighbor for 15 years, the kind of person who attended every gathering, always smiling, always neutral, always present when something needed to be witnessed. 5 people, all looking at me. Tom, Linda said, her voice smooth, almost relieved. You're early. I took a few steps into the room, letting my gaze move from one face to the next before settling back on her. "Plans changed," I said. No one moved to greet me. No one offered a coat, a drink, a seat. The table was already set, plates arranged, glasses filled, documents stacked neatly near Brian's elbow. That was the center of the room. Not the food, the papers. Linda gestured lightly toward the chair across from her. "Why don't you sit?" We were just about to start. I pulled the chair out and sat down without rushing, though it scraped softly against the floor. My hands rested on the table, still, controlled. Brian slid the stack of documents forward. "There are just a few things we thought it would be best to clarify before the holidays," he said. His tone was calm, professional, practiced. Kevin smirked faintly. Linda watched me closely. The lawyer opened a folder, and that's when it became clear. This wasn't a dinner. It was a transaction, and they expected me to sign. I looked at the papers for a long moment before touching them, not reading, just observing. Clean margins, legal formatting, tabs marking signature lines. It was all very polished, very intentional. They hadn't rushed this. They had planned it carefully, probably more carefully than they had ever planned anything involving me before. Brian nudged the stack slightly closer. "It's straightforward," he said. "Just restructuring a few things so everything runs more efficiently going forward." Efficient. That word almost made me smile. I placed my hand on the top page and slid it toward me. Linda watched my face closely, searching for something. Confusion, resistance, maybe even relief. Kevin leaned forward slightly, interested now. The lawyer sat still, pen ready, like a man who had done this many times before. I flipped the first page. Asset transfers. Second page. Property adjustments. Third. Account authority changes. Each one moved control, piece by piece, away from me and into structures that no longer require my involvement. Clean, quiet, permanent. I turned another page, slower this time. They expected hesitation here. There wasn't any. Instead, I reached for the pen. That was the moment the room shifted. Linda relaxed, just slightly, but enough to notice. Kevin's smirk sharpened. Brian exhaled through his nose, satisfied. Even the lawyer adjusted his posture, preparing to finalize something already decided. They thought this was the end of a process. They didn't understand it was the middle of one. I uncapped the pen and held it over the signature line. Let it hover there for a second longer than necessary, long enough for anticipation to settle in the room. Then I set the pen down, not on their documents. Next to them. "I brought something as well," I said. My voice stayed even. No edge, no emphasis. I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder, thicker than theirs, darker, less polished on the outside. I placed it gently on the table and turned it so it faced them. No one spoke. That silence mattered more than anything they had said so far. I opened the folder and slid the first document forward. Different letterhead, different law firm, older date. Before we go any further, I said, "You should read this." Brian's expression didn't change immediately. That was the interesting part. He assumed this was reaction, a counteroffer, something negotiable. Linda didn't reach for the papers. She looked at me instead. For the first time that evening, she wasn't prepared. The lawyer was the one who moved first. He leaned forward, pulled the document closer, and began reading. His eyes slowed after the second paragraph, then stopped entirely. That was when Brian leaned in. Kevin straightened. Linda finally looked down. I watched all of it without moving. "Tom," Brian started, but the confidence was gone now. Just slightly. Just enough. "It's already filed," I said. Simple. Quiet. Final. The lawyer flipped to the next page faster now. Then the next. I could see the exact moment he understood. These weren't new documents. They weren't proposals. They were active, binding, and most importantly, they had been in place long before tonight. No one touched the food. The steam rising from the trays had already started to thin, fading into the same still air that now filled the room. Everything that had been prepared, the dinner, the seating, the performance, was already becoming irrelevant. The lawyer cleared his throat quietly. "Where did you get this?" he asked, still looking down at the page. I signed it, I said. That usually helps. He didn't smile. He turned another page, slower this time, more careful. Brian leaned in closer, his confidence tightening into something sharper. Linda finally picked up the second document, her fingers less steady than before, though she tried to hide it by adjusting her grip. Kevin didn't bother reading. He looked at me, trying to measure what he had missed. There's a trust structure in place, the lawyer said after a moment. When was this executed? Updated 6 months ago. I replied. Revision started earlier. Linda's eyes moved faster, now across the page. I could see the exact moment certain words registered, not because she reacted outwardly, she didn't, but because she stopped blinking. That was always her tell. This doesn't make sense, she said quietly. These accounts were never fully joint, I said. I didn't interrupt her. I didn't raise my voice. I just placed the words into the space between us and let them settle. Brian straightened. What do you mean, not fully joint? He asked. I folded my hands on the table. Layered ownership, I said. Primary, secondary, conditional control. Standard structuring when you expect instability. Kevin let out a short, disbelieving breath. You're saying she didn't have access? I'm saying she had access. I replied, not control. The lawyer flipped again, faster now. There's a misconduct clause, he said. Broad language, very broad. Deliberately, I said. Linda looked up at me then. Not angry. Not yet. Just trying to understand how far this went. What kind of misconduct? She asked. I held her gaze. Financial deception. Misrepresentation. Undisclosed relationships that influence shared assets. The words hung there. Precise. Clinical. Irreversible. Brian shifted his weight. That's vague, he said quickly. That could mean anything. It doesn't, the lawyer said before I could respond. That was the moment the room turned. He sat back slightly, one hand still resting on the documents, the other now tapping lightly against the table. It triggers automatic review, he continued. Asset freezes, external audit flags, conditional holds on transfers. Kevin's smirk was gone now. Linda's grip tightened on the paper. Brian's expression hardened, but there was something behind it now. Calculation under pressure. I reached into the folder again and slid one more page forward. A notification. Time-stamped. Stamped again. Processed. Those triggers, I said, have already been activated. Silence. Not the quiet from before. This was different. This was the sound of realization, catching up. Linda's voice came out lower this time. When I didn't look away from her. Before I left for the lake. The lawyer exhaled slowly through his nose. Brian leaned back, just slightly. Kevin said nothing at all. And for the first time since I walked into that room, the structure they'd built, the dinner, the pressure, the expectation, was no longer holding. Brian recovered first. Not fully, but enough to speak. This doesn't change anything, he said a little too quickly. Reviews happen all the time. It's procedural. Temporary. Temporary. He said it like a man trying to convince himself. I nodded once, as if acknowledging a reasonable point. Of course, I said. Reviews are standard. Then I reached into my bag again. This time, I took out something smaller. A plain envelope. No markings. I placed it in front of Brian, not sliding it across the table like before, just setting it down within his reach, like something already meant for him. For you, I said. He didn't touch it immediately. That hesitation mattered. Go ahead, I added. Linda looked at the envelope, then at Brian, then back at me. The room had shifted again, but this time the tension wasn't contained. It was starting to spread. Brian picked it up, opened it. Inside were 2 flash drives and a folded sheet of paper. He unfolded the paper first. His eyes moved across it once. Then again, slower, the color drained from his face in a way he couldn't control. Kevin leaned forward. What is it? Brian didn't answer. He flipped the page over, as if expecting something on the back. There wasn't anything. Just the same printed timeline staring back at him. Dates. Transactions. Locations. Names. I watched him read it, carefully, methodically, like a man realizing the shape of something too large to ignore. "That's not," he started, then stopped. I spoke into the gap. "Expense reports," I said. "Consulting invoices. Reimbursements tied to accounts you don't personally oversee, but still approved." The lawyer's head turned slightly toward Brian. Linda's fingers tightened again around her document. Kevin stopped leaning, sat back instead. "There are patterns," I continued. "Repeated vendors, inflated service charges, funds routed through side agreements that never quite matched the declared purpose." Brian looked up at me. Now there was no confidence left, only calculation. "You're making assumptions," he said. I shook my head once. "No," I said, "I'm documenting." I tapped the flash drives lightly with one finger. Everything on those has already been duplicated, stored externally, time-stamped. I paused just long enough. Reviewed. The word landed heavier than the others. Linda turned toward Brian slowly. "What is he talking about?" she asked. Brian didn't answer her. That told me enough. I leaned back slightly in my chair, finally allowing a small shift in posture. "Linda," I said, my voice still even, "you weren't careful." Her eyes snapped back to me. "You moved money you didn't fully understand," I continued. "Small amounts at first, then larger ones. Always justified, always explainable on the surface." Her lips parted, but nothing came out. "The restaurant," I added. "That did it." Her expression changed. Not anger, recognition. "You remember," I said quietly. The failed investment she had insisted was harmless. A friend of a friend. A short-term opportunity. Money that wasn't being used anyway. Brian closed his eyes briefly. Just for a second. That was the moment everything connected for them. "The funding didn't come from where you thought it did," I said, "and the losses didn't stay where you expected them to." The lawyer pushed his chair back slightly, not dramatically, just enough to create distance. Kevin looked between Linda and Brian, his earlier certainty gone completely now. "You said it was clean," he muttered. No one responded. I stood up slowly, not to leave yet, just to change the angle of the room. "What you planned tonight," I said, looking at all of them now, "was efficient." I let that word sit there again. Then I added just as calmly, "But you built it on the assumption that I wasn't paying attention." Silence answered me, and this time it stayed. The silence didn't break. It fractured, not loudly, not all at once, just small movements, chairs shifting, paper sliding, someone exhaling too sharply. The kind of sounds people make when they realize control has already left the room. And then Megan spoke. "Dad, can I talk to you?" Her voice came from the hallway. I hadn't seen her come in. I turned slightly. She stood near the entrance, still in her coat, one hand gripping her bag like she hadn't decided whether she was staying or leaving. Her eyes moved between Linda and me, then settled on me alone. Linda stiffened. "Megan, this isn't—" "It is," Megan said quietly. "It is now." That was the first time I heard something solid in her voice that night. I nodded once and stepped away from the table. She led me into the living room, closing the door halfway behind us. Not fully, just enough to separate the space. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The Christmas lights on the tree were on, soft, warm, completely out of place. "I didn't know," she said finally. I watched her carefully. "I didn't know what was actually happening," she added. "Mom told me you were distant, that you checked out, that you didn't want this anymore." I didn't interrupt. She swallowed, her grip tightening on the strap of her bag. "She said you were preparing to leave, that tonight was just making it easier before things got worse." I let the silence sit for a second. "Did that make sense to you?" I asked. She shook her head immediately. "No," she said, "but I thought maybe I missed something." That word mattered. Missed. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone. A few taps. Then I handed it to her. "Open the folder labeled M," I said. She hesitated for half a second, then did it. Inside were files. Videos. Backups. Time-stamped records. Not everything, but enough. Enough for someone who wanted the truth. not a version of it. Her eyes moved as she scrolled. Slower, then slower again. "What is this?" she whispered. "Something I prepared," I said, in case the story changed before I could explain it myself. She looked up at me then, and for the first time that night, there was no confusion in her expression, just clarity. "You weren't leaving," she said. "No, you were waiting." "Yes." She exhaled slowly, like something inside her had finally aligned. "I found part of this," she said, "a few days ago, on the backup drive in your office. I didn't understand all of it, but enough. That explained it. The timing. Her being here. I wasn't supposed to," she added, but something felt off. I nodded. That's usually how it starts. She looked back at the phone, then closed the folder carefully and handed it back to me like it mattered. "I thought you were giving up," she said. "That you just stopped trying." I slipped the phone back into my pocket. "I don't give up," I said. "I document. Then I decide." She held my gaze for a second longer. Then she nodded once. Behind us, in the dining room, voices had started again. Lower now. Sharper. Controlled conversations breaking down into something less coordinated. Megan glanced toward the door. "They didn't expect this," she said. "No," I replied. Then I reached for the door handle. They expected me to be alone. I opened it. They miscalculated. By the time I stepped back into the dining room, the structure was gone. No more symmetry. No more calm arrangement. The plate sat untouched, the food cooling, forgotten. The documents were scattered now. No longer a clean stack, but separate pieces, each one carrying weight none of them had anticipated. Brian was on his phone, not speaking, listening. His jaw tightened with every second. Linda stood beside her chair, no longer composed, one hand pressed flat against the table like she needed it to stay upright. Kevin had gone quiet completely, his earlier confidence replaced by something closer to distance, like he was already trying to step away from what he'd been part of. The lawyer wasn't sitting anymore. He stood slightly back, one hand resting on the chair, the other holding his phone at his side, waiting. That told me enough. Then Brian spoke. "Understood," he said into the phone, his voice lower than before. Controlled but strained. "Yes, I'll cooperate." He ended the call slowly. No one asked. He didn't volunteer. But the silence pulled it out of him anyway. "They've suspended access," he said. "Full review. External." No one reacted immediately. Linda turned toward him. "What does that mean?" she asked. Brian didn't answer right away. That was the answer. At the same time, Linda's phone buzzed on the table. She looked at it, then picked it up. Her eyes moved once across the screen, then stopped. "Accounts are locked," she said quietly. Not to me, not to anyone in particular. Just said it. The room didn't move, didn't breathe. Kevin pushed his chair back slightly. "Linda." "Don't," she said. One word. Flat. Final. Mrs. Hargrove stood slowly, smoothing her coat like she needed something normal to hold on to. The lawyer cleared his throat again, but didn't speak. There was nothing left for him to structure. Everything had already been decided, just not by them. I picked up my coat from the chair. No one tried to stop me. No one asked me to stay. Megan stepped closer to me as I moved toward the door. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She just stood there, steady. I looked back once, not at Linda specifically, at all of them, at the table, at the remains of something that had been carefully planned and completely dismantled without a single raised voice. "This didn't have to be complicated," I said. "Calm, even, but you made it that way." No one responded. There was nothing left to argue. I opened the door. Cold air moving immediately, clean and sharp. For the first time that day, it didn't feel heavy. It felt clear. I stepped outside, the gravel crunching under my shoes again, the same sound as before, but now it marked something different. Not hesitation, not uncertainty. Conclusion. Behind me, the house stayed lit. Inside, everything they had built was already collapsing under its own weight. Calls being made, explanations failing, consequences unfolding faster than they could control. I didn't need to watch it happen. I had already seen enough. As I reached my car, I paused for a second, looking out at the quiet street, the soft glow of distant Christmas lights, the same world continuing without interruption. Then I got in, closed the door, and drove away, not defeated, not angry, just finished, and for the first time in a long time, completely in control.